Hello and welcome to the GovInsider Live Festival of Innovation. I'm Joshua Chambers, the founder of GovInsider, and over the course of this week, we will have sessions that celebrate public service success across the world. The writer Albert Camus once remarked that once the faintest stirring of hope became possible, the dominion of plague was ended. Well, that's the spirit of this event today, celebrating innovation, enthusiasm, and optimism. This event is free like all GovInsider events, and that is thanks to the support of our wonderful partners who made this possible. And joining me now is our keynote speaker for our first session. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Janil Putucheri, Senior Minister of State, Ministry for Communications and Information in the Government of Singapore, and he's also Minister in charge of GovTech, and he's going to be talking to us now about how GovTech has pivoted to adapt and fight this pandemic. Welcome, Dr. Putucheri.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you so much for joining us. Okay, well, I'm going to hand over to you for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. And this the fact that we can continue with this type of thinking around innovation and digital technology, even in the midst of this pandemic, is important to us, and it's important to me. I think that we're able to keep thinking about how we make things better. It's been about 9 months since we've first been hearing that word COVID-19. It started off as a localized public health emergency. It's become a global crisis. And, to say that it's changed the world dramatically, the word unprecedented has been used an unprecedented number of times. But the changes that we're now talking about using technology, using digital platforms, it didn't begin with COVID-19. It's this wave of transformation has been washing over us for some time. The digital revolution is not a new phenomenon. But what happened in the COVID-19, what is happening now in the COVID-19 pandemic and our response to that crisis is a focus of our energies, an acceleration to our sense of urgency to get this digitalization right. So I'm glad that this summit is happening, that people from around the world are being able to come together and connect and contribute ideas about how we can do this better. Here in Singapore, we're adapting to the lifestyle changes that COVID-19 has brought about. Many aspects of our economy and society, meanwhile, continue to function with the help of technology. Some of that was in place before. Some of that are things that we've done since the start of the crisis. The working from home to minimize traveling, the home-based learning that our students and teachers have engaged in. I don't think we can say those were quite the same prior to COVID-19, and we have indeed had to move quickly in order to adapt. But I wanted today to talk a little bit more and focus on what we've done with technology, I beg your pardon, to fight against COVID-19. We've had to develop a suite of digital tools to help meet the various needs that we have. And I would like to sort of break down those needs into different categories. There was the provisioning of information, making sure that people had the means to get reassurance as well as make inquiries. The second category would be about how the other aspects of economy, life, society had to carry on, and that was impacted by COVID-19. Then there are the kind of things that we needed to do within government that we couldn't do in quite the same way because of COVID-19. And lastly, there was the actual fight against the pandemic itself. So I'm going to give you some examples and some of our thoughts in these various areas. Sharing information with the public. I mean, the provision of timely facts to avoid uncertainty, to prevent confusion, to deal with anxiety and misinformation, essential in a crisis. And what we set up was a WhatsApp subscription service. And this basically pushes out information on a regular basis on the COVID-19 situation. It's available in 4 languages. Here in Singapore, we have 4 official languages. And we send multilingual messages. So when you subscribe, you can choose which languages you want to receive these messages in. We have about 1.2 million subscribers. And the key issue is that the kind of message that we send very quickly gets disseminated or provokes a reaction. We hope a reaction of assurance. But once people start to challenge it or there's misinformation going around, one of the best ways to deal with that is that everybody needs to get the same information within a very short period of time, so that there isn't a gap between the first person getting it and the last person getting it to be filled by a vacuum of misinformation and disinformation. And so our system makes sure that all the subscribers get the information within 30 minutes. And actually, very often, many nights, it is much less. We've also, websites are not exactly new technology, but using the website as a platform then to pull information together from a variety of service providers and arms of government, as well as allow some degree of transactionality to be stood up in a very short period of time, was an important part of our response. So we have two sites called Mask GoWare and Support GoWare, and they provide slightly different functionality to the public. The Mask GoWare was built on top of a stack which basically allowed our community organizations to distribute the work of supplying essential goods to the public across a wide variety of counters and ad hoc officers and spaces within the public housing estates, leveraging on both staff and volunteers. So basically a distribution exercise spread across the country, where the process of distribution was not always the same, was very heterogeneous. There were varying schedules, there were varying access points, and the member of public needed to know where their unique pickup point was. And you needed to go from an announcement to the first mask being available in a very short period of time and deal with all of this uncertainty. So Mask GoWare was basically a very complicated aggregator of information that then delivered personalized information to the citizen, I beg your pardon, across the city. Support GoWare was slightly different. This was really to provide a transaction with government agencies for grants, financial assistance, support, economic support, public assistance support to people who were very severely affected by the economic fallout from COVID-19, aggregating the front into one single front end, transactions across the whole of government, so that people could check their eligibility for support schemes and apply for them in one place. And this meant that the turnaround time for getting that assistance, whether it was a mask or a government grant, into the hands of the citizens was significantly reduced. And we did something very similar with business portals as well, because businesses were very severely affected. We needed to think through other aspects of government. So, for example, the planning of enforcement operations around safe distancing measures, internal reporting and planning. And basically our team in GovTech had to stand up a variety of dashboards and sense-making solutions in order then to very rapidly aggregate information that we had not thought of needing in quite the same way previously. One example would be crowdedness in malls and other public spaces. I mean, we have tools to be able to measure and share this information previously, but in the past, you'd never imagined you needed to do this on an hour-by-hour basis or several times a day. You use them for planning parameters across a much larger time frame. So we had to recalibrate quite a lot of our thinking around that. I think the key thing that I wanted to talk about, which I think a lot of people have an interest in, are our safe entry system and our Trace Together program. These were adjuncts to our contact tracing process. So contact tracing is one of the key pillars of our pandemic response. That in order to activate the other pillars in terms of the public health response around quarantine and isolation and proper treatment of people who have the disease, you needed to be able to do very quick, robust, and effective contact tracing. We wanted to make sure this happened as fast as possible and as effectively as possible. And so we stood up two systems to augment the professional efforts by our public health teams. And I stress that these are augmentations. We can't, and we don't intend to, replace the need for that public health professionalism around a judgment as to who should be quarantined under what circumstances. So these tools, one is Safe Entry and the other is Trace Together. They do very, very different things. Safe Entry is essentially a check-in, check-out log of people attending public places, businesses, where you're worried about prolonged non-transient contact. And the records are drawn on to develop what we call activity maps of COVID-19 cases, people who have proven to be COVID-19. We draw on this data, the safe entry data, to develop an activity map so that the contact tracers can think through the whereabouts of that individual as quickly as possible. Trace Together is quite different, and it's based off the Bluetooth signals, and it uses Bluetooth signals to log proximity with other Trace Together users. We got this app going very early, and it took some engineering effort, and I want to commend the teams for doing this. But we've iterated and improved it, including open sourcing the code so that we can make it available to the world, and as well as, frankly, we can benefit from people's insights into our code. It's been effective. It's helped to shorten the contact tracing. The combination of these various devices and processes have helped to shorten the contact tracing process. From several days now down to just a few days, 2 or 3 days, to get the activity map and the network of contacts identified very quickly. But the success depends on how well utilized these processes are. Safe entry, we've been able, through a regulatory means, make compulsory for businesses, malls, various other public spaces, that you have to log in and log out, check in and check out. Trace Together, it's voluntary, and people can choose to use an app on a phone, and we're starting to roll out a token as well. So far, we've had 2.4 million downloads of the app on people's phones. That's about 40% of the population. But the effectiveness is going to be limited unless we can drive that number up. We need everyone to be covered, ideally, through this Trace Together program. And so the tokens that I mentioned operate on the same protocol. And so the interaction with the phones that have the app operate on the same protocol. And so as a citizen, you can either carry the token or have the app active on your phone, and you're part of the program. And of course, we do want to make it better for the citizens, more convenient. We hope to be able to improve the app so that more functionality is available to the user. For example, we've made it possible to do the safe entry program check-in using the Trace Together app. So you now only have to worry about one process and one app on your phone. So more convenience, more functionality, but we want to make sure that it works for the citizens. As I said, we've open sourced it. We hope other people can contribute ideas about how we can do this better, and we'd very much like to hear about how we can do it better. This collaborative approach to the rest of the world, this international community that we want to be a good partner with and work with, was built on a long history of close friendships and relationships, public sector as well as private sector, to do development on a wide variety of products. And it requires some thinking through the data sharing protocols, the privacy protection protocols. But if we can get this right, if we can get this internationalization correct, it will be, I think, an important part of resuming cross-border exchanges gradually but safely, so that we have these protections of an augmented contact tracing process. We've started some work. We've got the Safe Travel Pass portal, which we've stood up to address some of the reciprocal green lane arrangements. So those countries that we have special arrangements for travel with, again, we are using technology to augment the administrative process of getting people in and out, filing applications, tracking COVID-19 results, and then subsequently checking in and checking out. So there's a lot of these tools that we will need to continue to think about. And having that base that we have here in Singapore of a very, what's the word, a wired nation. You know, we have the combination of many years of investments in infrastructure, high-speed broadband networks, a very high phone adoption rate, a very high internet penetration rate. It makes some of these things possible. But I think one of the most important things is our population's attitude towards technology, that it can be a useful tool to address problems in general, but this crisis in particular. And this gives us, in a way, a sense of hope that we can take a similar approach towards what is likely going to be the biggest long-lasting effect of this crisis, which is on our economy, and that we can use technology to transform jobs and create opportunities going forward. And all of this requires that same approach to how we use technology to best help our citizens. I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Janil. It was a great pleasure to hear that. And you mentioned a wired nation, or perhaps a smart nation. How did this existing smart nation drive that Singapore has help with GovTech pivoting quickly to battle COVID-19?
Yeah, well, I didn't want to do the buzzword of just selling my own smart nation. So thank you for that, Josh. Very, very much appreciated. We do very much want to keep striving in this smart nation journey. And the things that we had done over the last 2 or 3 years clearly made it possible for us to get quite a lot done under COVID-19. So as I mentioned, the high penetration rate of having mobile phones, if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be able to even contemplate the Trace Together app process. Similarly, the fact that we've got very good mobile coverage for our telcos and a high level of service quality that's expected of them means that some of these solutions then can be mobile only or mobile first. We've got a fairly high speed broadband backbone here in Singapore, and so quite a lot of things that can be done cloud-based. So it's made a lot of these development processes possible and even desirable. But I would point to one single factor, which I personally think if we didn't have and we hadn't paid some attention to several years ago, I think our method of responding to the COVID-19 crisis using technology would have been quite different. And that was our decision to bring back into the public sector and government a significant engineering capability. And that's why GovTech exists. So we've got 2,800 staff, engineers at the heart of government, building some of this stuff. And over the last few years, they've built out a government tech stack. That combination of a tech stack built by our public sector engineers, operated and run by them, and having that capability, that talent within the public sector, meant that when we needed something built in a hurry, there were many things we needed built in a hurry, including, for example, our interface towards WhatsApp, Mask Go Where, the initial Trace Together protocol. We could turn to our teams and say, stop everything, order your pizzas for the night, and get this built. And we had a whole lot of engineers volunteering to get involved in this, and this is what they love doing, and they were very, very enthusiastic about it, but they put their heart and soul in it and built it. I think if we'd had to rely on a normal government procurement process, a normal type of time cycle through which government does development in this space, we wouldn't have been able to move as quickly as we did. Having said that, we are very grateful to the private sector and various partners who are coming on board, and we're now transitioning to a much more normal way of running these things. But having had that ability to just get going the minute it was clear that this is what we needed to, I think was an important part of what we've been able to do as a result of our Smart Nation push. So, props to all the engineers working in our public sector. Thank you very much for your dedication and hard work.
And you've mentioned the tech stack. You also mentioned open source a little bit earlier as well. What value has open source had towards driving the Smart Nation vision, and of course what you're doing at the moment?
Well, we're quite committed to this idea that we don't have a monopoly on either the best ideas or the best way of doing things. We can get things going, but having a wide surface area of developers and the community involved is important. And getting stuff open sourced is one of the best ways of doing that. If you can prep your product and your code base and your approach to the point where you are confident at open sourcing, that imposes a certain discipline on yourselves in terms of security, privacy, and the elegance of your engineering in terms of your resources. But once you have open sourced it, there are a few things that happen. One is people look at your code and from a fairly unbiased perspective, or even a usefully biased perspective, tell you what's wrong with it and how you can get it better. Secondly, people implement it in ways that you hadn't quite considered as being desirable or necessary, and that is very instructive to us as well. So we find that open source approach very useful at making our products better. Ultimately, though, the reason is that we've built this for the public good, and so we open source it because we hope more people can benefit from it. Our tech stack is central to many of our efforts. It means that we can ensure that new products, new services, new platforms that are built are interoperable with each other, and we have control over that interoperability, both current as well as previous products. And you don't quite open source a tech stack, but we're very open about our tech stack. We have a developers conference every year. We have several offices. It's called Stack. It's a tech stack developers conference. We call it Stack because and people come and get involved. They tell us how we can get it better, and they come up with great ideas about products that they would like to integrate with our tech stack. And which brings me to the third benefit of our approach, which is that a community of developers and engineers feel very willing and interested and engaged to come up with ideas to make the public space better. So when we organize hackathons on a regular basis, people come forward and get engaged. They see this as an opportunity for engineering public good, but there are business opportunities in there for them as well. And so it's a virtuous self-reinforcing cycle. A tech stack with open interoperable standards and an approach towards open sourcing code as and when we can, and the engagement with a community of engineers and developers. I find these are self-reinforcing strategies that have worked well for us.
Let's talk a little bit about the challenges as well, though. What sort of challenges have you encountered as you've tried to build tech solutions to battle this pandemic?
Well, public trust, data security, and inclusivity. I don't know why things come in threes, but it's a handy number. But public trust, data security, and inclusivity. Let me start with the last one first. You're building something for the public good, and if you can't be assured that this will reach everybody that you are caring for, you have to come up with other means, or you have to, in a way, consider whether you've got the right approach. If, for example, in contact tracing, the access to the Trace Together program is vital for the safety and security of our populace and specific individuals, then having the ability to roll out the Trace Together program to the entire population is important. And that's fundamentally why we didn't say, well, it's just an app and whoever has a phone can download it and leave it at that. I mean, high penetration rates, but if there's 10 or 20% of our population that don't use smartphones for whatever reason, we need an alternative for them, which is why we came up with the token, so that there is a means for 100% inclusion. And that's a principle under which we operate. You must have means for 100% inclusion. Much more prosaically, away from COVID-19, if you have some government transaction, which ordinarily would be a piece of paper, or submit your documents. We don't use faxes anymore. I hope we don't use faxes anymore. But if you are going from a paper-based solution to a digital solution, then can we be guaranteed that 100% of everybody doing the transaction can transact using, for example, the National Digital Identity or some mobile app? And if the answer is no, then we need to engineer a parallel process so that people can turn up to a counter, and then on their behalf, a public sector official can fill the digital gap for them. So that is a principle that we have to make sure that we adhere to. The other issues of privacy and security, the security question for us is no different from what the rest of the world has to think about. That as you do all this, you generate data, and that constitutes a risk that people will be interested in. We have had some benefit from the fact that we've had for a few years now our cybersecurity agency, as well as our government services working hand in hand to try to improve our security posture. And so many of the products that we built were layered on top of applications, microservices, and this tech stack that I talked about. So there's a fair amount of security already baked in, but that's never going to be sufficient. And some of these products, the risk associated with the end product was not what you had thought of when you first started the crisis response. And so you need a team that's spending quite a lot of time and effort going in and auditing the security of your various platforms and services. And I think that's an important challenge to get right, because if you overdo it, you hold back the development. You underdo it, then you might have the development go very fast, but one breach, and then you set the whole effort back because now no one can trust this process, and you have to stand up a process in parallel. Privacy is something unique to the social compact that every government and its citizens need to engage in. We have had over the last few years an ongoing conversation around data privacy and what would be the appropriate posture on data privacy. But in maintaining that public trust is vital, because ultimately these products don't work if people are not willing to log on and to fire up their phone and download the apps. Maintaining that public trust and cooperation is absolutely vital to overcoming this challenge.
Fantastic. Minister, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a huge pleasure to be able to speak with you.
Thank you very much, Josh. Always a pleasure to come on to your various platforms and answer your not so easy questions. They are very, very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you and goodbye. Thank you, Minister. And
Bye-bye.
now in this Festival of Innovation, I'm going to hand over to my moderator, my colleague moderator, Dr. Tanya, who leads the Digital State Project at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. And she's also the founder of StateUp. And she's going to have a fantastic panel discussion now with Audrey Tang, the Digital Minister of Taiwan, and Minister Paola, the Minister for Technological Innovation of Italy. Dr. Filer, are you with us?
Thank you. Yes, I am, Joshua. It's a pleasure to join you today and to chair this opening panel. And, you know, as Joshua mentioned, we have two fantastic ministers joining us today who, each in their own unique way and in very different national contexts, has led a remarkable effort over the past few months in engaging innovation to better confront the COVID-19 crisis. So thank you, Ministers Pisano and Tang, for joining us today across your various time zones. I know that both I and our audience are very curious to hear about your recent efforts in relation to pandemic responsiveness. So we're joined here now by Minister Audrey Tang and Minister Paola Pisano in Italy. Now, of course, the story of pandemic responsiveness is on everybody's mind at the moment. But of course, government innovation doesn't appear from thin air. If it did, perhaps we would have even more of it in the world today. So I want to hear, to start with, a little bit about that longer story, because often government innovation, in fact, is quite a long and sometimes arduous process to get off the ground and to embed into institutions and organizations. So I want to start our conversation thinking about that longer story. So to turn first to you, Audrey, Taiwan has embedded a culture of innovation in government, in no small part, it must be said, due to your great efforts, that has come to be seen on the international stage as part of the very personality of the state in some ways. So I'd love to hear about that process. What was the process? What was the journey that has enabled innovation to be embedded in that way?
Sure. Can you hear me? Is the sound getting through? Okay. Okay, great. Right. Hey, very happy to be here. Yeah, I think in very kind of time-lapse movie kind of way, my personal journey started in 2014. When we occupied our parliament for 22 days, arguing that because the MPs were refusing to deliberate the cross-strait service and trade agreement with Beijing, the people should occupy their office and do their jobs for them. That was the legitimacy theory. And with 500,000 people on the street and many more online, we managed to deliberate with about 20 different NGOs, all the important aspects of the CSSTA, and actually get 4 consensus demands. Not one less, that was then accepted by the head of the parliament. And because of this experience, people in Taiwan, at the end of that year in 2014, basically any mayor that campaigned on open government won the election, and any mayor that did not get elected. And right after that, we were hired as young reverse mentors, that is to say people under 35 years old, to work closely with ministers in order to make sure that open innovation is a new national direction. So it's roughly 5 years journey. And now you can see my office here. I have here is my office. Yes. So this is literally my office, and it's a park, the Social Innovation Lab. We tore down the walls. Anybody can walk in. Just yesterday, somebody walked in and gave me 50 rainbow, masks, and it's like all very spontaneous. And we have more than 12 ministries people working here in a way to, in a cross-silo way, to listen to all the new ideas, and even like the mayor of Prague visited and decided that their staff want to climb on it. And bring, for example, people would bring self-driving vehicles and so on, where we systematically looked at the digitization, the innovation, the governance, and the inclusion of each and every new technology, so that we can share this like a sandbox, co-create with people, and culminate in like presidential hackathons, where every year the president herself gives trophies to 5 social innovation teams that, for example, use machine learning to solve water leakage problem, for example, to use telemedicine to solve for remote islands and so on. And the trophy is the shape of Taiwan with a micro projector. If you turn it on, it projects the president herself handing you the trophy. So it's a meta trophy that describes itself, and that basically said, whatever you did in the past 3 months will become national policy in the next 12 months. And so the social sector, the public sector, and the private sector, thanks to the Social Innovation Lab, as well as the hackathons, always form the data collaboratives so that people can contribute their piece of the puzzle, so to speak, and increase trust throughout each and every project that they collaborate, for example, on measuring air quality, predicting earthquakes in advance, disaster recovery, and so on. So I would argue that by the time that COVID hits us, there is already more than 20 different teams that had very good experience collaborating with the public sector, from the social sector as well as the private sector. And that forms kind of the backbone of trust. And of course, all the meetings and lobbying with me on that particular office is made open source. It's published to the internet for everybody to see. So the lobbyists always argue from a public benefit viewpoint and never from a private interest viewpoint. This is how we turn the kind of opposition between different positions into co-creation of common values. So that's the simple answer, I hope, for your question.
Thank you. And Paola, in your case, you personally have been involved in building innovative digital communities at various different levels and scales. So at the level of the 5-star movement, of the city, and now nationally. Is there a common thread between what you found to work in terms of embedding innovation at each of those scales?
Hi, hello. Thank you for the question. Good morning for me in Italy. And I think that when I start my experience in the city, I had the opportunity to start to understand how the citizen interact with the innovation and how we have to push as a public actor innovation inside our society and digitalization. So when I start to work at the national level, I bring with me this list of experience and understand that what is important in the diffusion of digitalization and starting digitalization inside our government is the interaction and the strong relationship between the private and the public sector. Another things that it's important for us is define strong policy and list of rules to help all the public administration to pass from the analogic services to the digital services. As in Italy, we have more than 23,000 of public administration divided in local, regional, and national public administration. If we want to have an interaction that is easy for our citizen, we need to define strong rules, and help the public administration to pass from the analogical services to the digital services. For this reason, we are pushing in this moment some important ingredients for us. The first one is the broadband technology and the connection in all our countries. Because what happened in Italy is that we have a good connection in some part of our countries, and then we don't have connectivity in other parts of our country. So during the COVID-19, for example, that we have the lockdown of all the activities in our country, we had some problem with the smart working and distance learning in some region of our countries. And so this creates a social divide, not only a digital divide in our Italy, in our country. So this is the first things that we need to improve. And as we start a strong project with the European Union, the Recovery Fund, we will allocate some fund on the connectivity in our country. Another point that I would like to underline is the use of cloud computing in the developing of the digital services. And this is another important thing in Italy, because and now a lot of services, digital services in Italy are developing without using cloud computing technology. And this create a lot of problem, especially in the cost field and in the rapidity that we need to have in the developing of services. And finally, in the interoperability between our data. And so what we understand is that if we define clear rules inside the public administration and we push some ingredient in the digital transformation, then we help also the private market to create the services that the public administration need to improve the services for citizens.
Thank you. Audrey, you of course have created now this long run culture of innovation. How has it helped you in the current context? How has the culture that you've created helped you to rapidly innovate to tackle the pandemic?
Yes, in Taiwan, we never had a lockdown for the current pandemic. We fight off the pandemic with no lockdown and the infodemic with no takedown. And this is because the social sector always respond very quickly through what we call the social innovation 3 pillars, and that's fast, fair, and fun. And the fast part, which is collective intelligence, as I mentioned, people on the discussion boards and things like that very quickly escalated that Dr. Li Wenliang, the Wuhan whistleblower, reported that there's 7 new SARS cases. And this gets upvoted actually last year, so that by this year, the first day of this year, we started health inspections for flight passengers from Wuhan. And because we have had a lot of conversations with the social sector, they also tells us that Taiwan, according to them, the Civicus Monitor, the Human Rights Watch, were the only country in Asia that has a completely open space, so that the governments trust citizens enough to upvote such new ideas into their daily Central Epidemic Command Center live-streamed press conference. So anyone with any new idea can just call this simple toll-free number, and this respond to the earlier remark about inclusion, because everybody have a landline or a mobile phone. They can call this number and tell the Central Epidemic Command Center what they would like to see, what they would like to change. And just based on this very simple call center technology, of course, augmented with logbots and so on, we would say that through chatbot or through the 1922 or through the daily press conference, people would say, hey, you're rationing masks, and now we're seeing that the pharmacists across the islands are helping us, but our pharmacist only ration pink medical mask to us, and my boy would not want to go to school because he said he would get bullied because he's a boy, and so on. And the very next day, all the medical officers, including Minister Chen Shizhong, wore pink medical masks to show solidarity, and suddenly the boy become the most hip boy in his class. And so that's the fast part. It's a very quick turnaround. And also when we're rationing the mask, at the beginning, people were not sure which places has and which place doesn't have masks. So a bunch of people called the GovZero movement, which systemically look at all the government websites and services which ends in something.gov.tw and built alternate versions called join.g0v.tw, worked there, and then propose this visualization where you can see very clearly where the masks are still available and where not. And because I'm also part of the GovZero, so I look at their work and then informed our premier saying that we need to trust citizens with open data. So I agree with your minister that open source is important. But if you provide open data in every 30 seconds, it's become open API. It increases the trust by people queuing in a pharmacy. Nowadays, they can use their national health insurance card to collect 9 medical masks per 2 weeks. So people queuing will expect that people before them, after they receive the mask, the number will, in a couple of minutes, become 49. And so everybody trusts the rationing system more. And if it rather goes up, they will call 1922 right there. And not just for people with sight, right? For people with blindness and so on. We also have voice assistants and so on contributed by the social sector. So when we're ramping up the mass production, everybody see that it's indeed ramping up. And when people, for example, a legislator, an MP who served as VP of data analytics at Foxconn said that, hey, there's a citizen map that shows that the distribution is not very fair in county to county. The Minister Chen, who has enjoyed great popularity, did not defend the existing policy. He just said, legislator teach us, and then we co-created and revised the system. So Ms. Gao, the MP, said, oh, in the wake of yesterday's questioning is today's improvement. So this kind of collaboration is very important, because even for people who work very long hours and after they go home, all the pharmacies close. Based on these analysis, we work then with convenience store so they can pick it up 24 hours a day. So you see our premier smiling happily here, because we're now working with convenience stores since the beginning of March. And altogether, it enabled more than 95% of people in Taiwan have access to medical masks, and thereby reducing the R value to under 1, which is why we managed to counter the pandemic with no lockdowns.
Thank you. And I just want to ask you a little bit more about the dimension of fun that you noted, because some of what you were saying really resonates, I think, with broader theories of cultural agency. I'm thinking, for example, of the Colombian mathematician and former mayor Antanas Mockus, who referred to government innovation campaigns that use humor as a kind of cultural acupuncture. So the idea being that you engage humor or other forms of art at a critical pressure point to change behaviors. So Audrey, I'd love to hear what role you see for humor in terms of implementing government innovation while achieving high levels, hopefully, of citizen support.
Definitely. in our government, in each ministry, there's a team called participation officers who meet every month. Like media officer talk to journalists and the parliamentary officer talking to the MPs. The participation officers essentially talk to trending hashtags. They have to work with the people's ideas and then incorporate the people's ideas into co-creation energy. How do you engage a hashtag? Well, you use humor. And so as you can see here on my screen, our slogan is called humor over rumor. So whenever there is a rumor about something, for example, this is, of course, an anxious time and people do share, for example, I quote, we're going to run out of tissue paper soon because the tissue paper material is being used to make medical masks, for example. That was a real rumor, and unquote. And a couple hours after that, the premier, working with the participation officers, wrote out this very simple meme. And this meme, very interestingly, is shaped like a tissue paper box. It actually contains a tissue paper box. And this shows Premier and with his backside, wiggling it a little bit, and says very clearly in large font that each of us only have one pair of buttocks. And it's a wordplay because in Mandarin, to stockpile tuan sounds the same as bottom tuan. And so basically it's saying stockpiling makes no sense because the medical masks are made of domestic material while tissue paper made of South American material. And if the panic buying caused by the outrage maybe travel on the R value of 3, this humor travel on R value of maybe 5. That is to say every hour on average, each person will share to 5 other people. And this is not just one shot. When people panic buy instant noodles, our premiers posted something saying, oh, there's plenty of instant noodle, buy as much as you want. And then don't forget to add some vegetable to it, have a balanced diet. And so people, again, it become a festival of agricultural products. And the participation of officer of the Ministry of Health and Welfare literally lives with this dog. And so whenever there's a new scientific clarification, like for outdoor, you have to keep 3 Shiba Inu away. Indoor, keep 3 Shiba Inu away. Remember to cover your mouth. Pre-order your mask. But why wear a mask? Because the mask protect you against your own unwashed hand. And these are all very great memes that ideas were spreading, that when people receive those ideas, they become vaccinated against conspiracy theories. So that's the humor over rumor part.
Thank you for sharing those incredibly creative ideas and approaches. Now, in Italy, of course, there was a bad outbreak of COVID-19 very early on, with, in some sense, less lesson learning available to draw upon from other contexts as a result. So in that context, Minister Pisano, how did you go about creating digital services and enabling innovation and making good decisions with relatively little to go on in terms of immediate examples from elsewhere?
Yes, we start to understand the pandemic and the huge impact of the pandemic at the beginning of March, and then after a few days we start with the lockdown of all the activities because we had a huge impact in our country, especially in the north of Italy. So we had 3 kinds of problem. The first problem was in the health sector. So to create a good reaction to all the citizens that had contracted the virus. The second challenge was in the economic sector, because as we stop all the activity in Italy, we had a strong impact in all the economic part and the social part. And finally, we try to support the citizen with all the digital services. So as my part is around digital and innovative services, I would like to concentrate more this question on this initiative. What we did is we launched some initiative around the digital sector, always interacting with the private sector and with the strong collaboration of all our citizens. Because I would like to underline that for us in Italy, that lockdown was cover all Italy and all the citizens. So we spend few weeks inside our home without having the possibility to interact with other people except by internet and by using the digital services. So the first initiative that we launched immediately after a couple of days was named Solidarietà Digitale. In English is Digital Solidarity. It was a public call to the private sector and association to offer their products or digital services for free to citizens, so citizens could go carry on with their routines during all the containment measures. The second initiative push innovation inside our country, and the name was Innovation for Italy, and we invited companies, university, private and public sector, research center to propose innovative way to prevent, contain and manage COVID-19. Innovative way, an innovative idea, especially where we have more problem, for example, in the hospital actors, or in the logistic approach, or in the testing, in the tracking of the COVID-19. In this last field, we define a fast call, especially for the telemedicine and data analysis, to identify the best technological solution to support the telemedicine and the exposure notification to COVID-19. And we work on Immuni, that is the Italian contact tracing application, and that is completely compliance with our regulation on data protection, the GDPR European regulation. The last thing that I would like to underline is that the epidemic represents also an opportunity to innovate not only the public sector, but to help also the startup and SMEs in Italy to produce innovative solution to the urgent needs of our country. And sometimes it's difficult in Italy to push the and to help and support, interact with the SMEs part of our country. So that was also a great opportunity for them that had a big response to this kind of challenge.
Thank you for describing that incredibly holistic approach that you've taken. Now, we're at an innovation festival that looks and feels different to festivals we may have been at previously in recent years. So let's continue a little bit with that future-oriented theme. And I want to discuss what the role of digital transformation and innovation will be in supporting a recovery that looks better, perhaps, than our pre-COVID-19 world. So Audrey, for you, what role do you see for digital technologies and the people who understand them in helping us to reimagine and hopefully to construct a preferable post-pandemic future?
Thank you. That's a great question. To me, as evidenced by this Venn diagram of the Sustainable Development Goals, digital is, for me, not the information and communication technology, which will be SDG 9 here, but rather the digital is about people. It's about building a society where people can trust even for very different countries and for very different sectors, trust each other's numbers, trust each other's data, trust that our data will not be abused or turned into surveillance capitalism or statism. This is about making the state transparent to the people, not the people transparent to the state. In short, these are about the 3 SDG goals, which is 17, 18, availability of reliable data. And to me, the effective partnership, as remarked by your minister in the very beginning, relies on people feel that they're included and that this system is trustworthy. And what better to build trust other than have the people determine the kind of, for example, the mask availability map, or for example, how to make sure that a digital fence works with no extra app installed, as your minister remarked. If people do not need to install an extra app, but rather piggybacking on some form factor that people are already used to before the pandemic, then that's a much more effective relationship and partnership. And finally, the open innovation, that is to say, pandemic enable us to work as a world, right, to solve global scale issues. And we will learn from this new norm where we can just have 3 ministers join on the same panel talking about the same issue and work on other issues such as climate change or disinformation crisis or any of, quantum crypto analysis and things that affect the entire society in a way that connects the society together rather than just be part of the economic sector. So my job description is literally a transition between the technology sector to the digital part, which to me connects the 3 sectors. And it goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it the Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear the singularity is near, let us always remember the plurality is here. And post-COVID, we will all remember that the plurality is here. It's not just about a linear growth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I understand Minister Pisano needs to leave in a moment. So if you just have a final remark, perhaps, on the future of services, that would be wonderful to hear. Minister, I believe you're muted at the moment.
Sorry. Okay. As we, with the pandemic, we have also a great opportunity to collaborate with our other country in Europe and to have the strong support of the European Union, especially with the Recovery Fund. And our Prime Minister, Giuseppe Conte, will have a strong relationship with the European Union, and then was very good to push Italy ahead and to help Italy to reach 200 billion of euro of the Recovery Fund. Now we have a great opportunity not only to give an answer to the COVID-19, but also to improve what didn't work until now in our country, especially in the 3 sectors: the digitalization, the social sector, and the green part. So we are defining project with all other ministers in order to give to Italy the opportunity to develop the instruments that are useful in this historical period. For my part, the important things is, as underlined before, the connectivity, the cloud computing, the new kind of generation technology, like, for example, 5G technology, that in Italy we had a lot of testing and experimentation of 5G technology, but now we need to pass to the deployment of this technology. Then the data, and what the digital minister Audrey said, the open data and the use of data as information So interoperability that in Italy is not so effective in this moment. And the use of data to understand strategy for the government and to understand also the impact of our old strategy and our law inside our country. And then an important thing is also the competence and in all the level of our society, not only for the student, but also for all the population. So we create a huge project. The name is Digital Republic, always with the interaction between the public and the private sector. And in this project, we aim to train the population on the basic of digital skill until the high level of digital competence. This is a hard work, and in general, also the digital services in Italy it's a hard work because we need to create some common narrative. So cloud connectivity, cloud competence, and finally digital services. We create digital services in Italy, start from the digital identity and a common channel and common application in the smartphone where the citizen can find all the digital services of the public administration. I know that this is only the beginning and we have a long path to do, a long a long list of activities, but what is good is that all the country now start to understand that the digitalization and the innovation is an important key to live better and to have more opportunity in our countries.
Thank you so much. I think the global reach of the pandemic is very much drawing attention to the need for policymakers facing similar and globally entwined challenges to learn from each other and to share also with the broader global community. So I'm really grateful to the ministers today for sharing and accelerating that diffusion of knowledge. Thank you so much, and back over to Joshua to continue the festivities.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Tanya, for your expert moderating as well. It's always a pleasure to see you. And now we go straight into our next session, Security by Design. We have an incredible lineup for you now, folks. We have Kieran Martin, Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations from the Blavatnik School of Government. Liisa Paas, the outgoing Chief National Cyber Risk Officer in the National Security and Defence Coordination Unit at the Government Office, Republic of Estonia. Dr. Shashi Jayakumar, Head of the Centre of Excellence for National Security at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore, and Tanya, the Senior Vice President of EMEA Trend Micro. And this session is going to be chaired by my friend and colleague, Amit Roy Chowdhury, the local cybersecurity and technology journalist. Amit, I think we have you on the line.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Joshua, and thank you for introducing this great panel. So I don't need to go into another introduction, and everyone is, I'm sure, eager and waiting to hear their views. But as you know, today's discussion, it's a bit wordy, but it nevertheless encapsulates what is happening, and we need the need to build a resilient system that can cope with risks and supports. Has always been the case over the last few years, thanks to the increase in cyber attacks and things like WannaCry and all these other malwares, which affected millions of computers in 2017. And there have been other incidents also, too numerous to sort of list in this panel. But now with the COVID-19 and this explosion in remote working and use of networks for innovative ways, like, for example, this particular GovInsider session being totally virtual, the need for resilient networks has gone up, incrementally or proportionately or whatever way you want to say it, but it's gone up drastically. So without further ado, I'll just ask Professor Ciaran to start his presentation, and then we'll go through the 4 presentations, and after that we'll have a short panel discussion to sort of elaborate on some of the issues that are going to be raised during these presentations. So Professor Ciaran, over to you.
Hello, Amit. Hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me and see me okay. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful event. It's great to be able to do it virtually, although I do miss seeing friends across the world, particularly in Singapore. My name is Kieran Martin. I work at Oxford University at the Blavatnik School of Government, but until last week, I was the first head of the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre. In that role, which I held for around 6 years in various guises, 2 of the countries represented today were some of our closest partners in Singapore and Estonia. And if Liisa and I are looking relaxed and happy, it's because we're both several days out of government. So I want to pay tribute to colleagues and friends in Singapore, particularly David Koh and Gwenda Fong, who I know is speaking in another part of the program from the Cybersecurity Agency. It's been one of the best partners that we had in the UK. I'm not really going to talk about the attacks that we've seen. I'm going to take it for granted that if people are on this call, they're sufficiently worried about cybersecurity to be aware of some of the problems. I think that secure by design is one of the most, if not the most important strategic challenge and opportunity facing the global cybersecurity community. So I want to say a little bit about the requirement of secure by design, why we need it, the problem, why we don't have secure by design, and the solutions and opportunities that the current era presents. The requirement, I think our excellent moderator has already located it in the context of the pandemic. I'm in my mid-40s and I cannot recall a time when there was so much fear and concern around the globe as there has been in 2020. There's fear about people's health and the health of their loved ones, and there's fear about our economic prospects. And technology has been one of the things holding us together. It's kept us professionally going, and it's kept us personally functional in terms of being connected to our friends and family in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So public confidence in technology is now a public requirement. The moderator mentioned the large-scale working from home. I actually think it's gone really quite well, given the risks. When the National Cybersecurity Centre, when I headed it, when we would advise organisations on how to manage cybersecurity risk, a sudden rush in a matter of days from largely office-based working to largely home-based working in an unplanned way wouldn't have been something we'd recommended because of the disruptive risk. But it's gone pretty well. Organisations and governments deserve credit for that. Just think how much worse off we would be in one of the most difficult years in recent history across the world. How much worse things would be if we had a serious wobble in public confidence in technology. But I think public confidence in technology is at risk. We've had all sorts of data scandals, all sorts of concerns about misinformation, misuse of technology, malevolent use of technology for illicit purposes, whether criminal or espionage or terrorist and so forth. But I think problems in security are part of the problem in terms of maintaining public confidence in technology. The fact that there are so many cyber attacks, the fact that people feel that their networks and devices are inherently vulnerable. So security is part of the strategic challenge of making sure we have public confidence in technology, and that's the requirement. So what's the problem? The problem is no one designed the internet, and no one designed the internet with safety in mind. The history of the internet is now reasonably well understood. It grew organically and incrementally through universities, military networks, and so forth, with the aim of enhancing free connectivity. If you look at, for example, the brilliant book written a very long time ago now by Cliff Stoll called The Cuckoo's Egg, it's the story about how some hackers sponsored by the Soviet Union, based out of Germany, infiltrated US networks using the time-honored techniques of logging in, with the username guest and the password, and roaming through networks and so forth, because they were designed to be connected rather than to be secure. And there's a wonderful pronouncement by Vint Cerf of Google, one of the, if you like, godfathers of the internet. He said, when we were building the internet, we didn't focus enough on those who would try to break the system. So over time, over the 90s, the 2000s, and the last decade, a system evolved where people got onto the internet by giving away personal data for free. That was the price of entry. There are all sorts of challenges with that model, but it's a terrible security model. One of the many ways in which it's a terrible security model is that a security conscious consumer, whether it's an organization, whether it's a company, or whether it's a private individual, just can't choose. If you say, I care about security, so I'm willing to pay a little bit more, how do I get a more secure web-based product? Most people don't know. There's no information out there, there's no pricing, there's no sort of consumer guides. And if consumers can't change, then industry has no incentive. Security doesn't pay. So the solution is to make security pay, and therefore secure by design will follow. I think one of the things the UK has tried to do in conjunction with partners and allies like Singapore and indeed Estonia is try to fix some of these underlying structural problems of the internet. I think it's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's quite interesting to focus on the history of what governments and industry across the world have done to make automobiles safer over the last half century. They used to be very dangerous. There are still risks, and sadly people still die in car accidents, but there are far fewer of them, even though there are far more cars on the roads than there were 50 years ago. And part of that's education, teaching people how to drive safely. Part of that's regulation, traffic lights, anti-alcohol driving laws and so forth. But part of it is just making cars safer through engineering and regulation of engineering in ways that people don't see. It's making sure that if there's a head-on collision, the engine of one car doesn't fly through the windshield of another car. And there's something around that for me in terms of what we do with the next phase of technology, whether that's hardware, whether that's firmware, or whether it's software. We have to make it safe. And at the moment, a bit like cars 50 years ago, there are too many defective products and services that we allow on the digital highway. So part of this is about industry, just wising up to the problem, marketing security better. Part of it's about consumer behavior, consumers finding ways of being pickier, but there is a role for government. So last October, in my final visit to Singapore as head of the NCSC, David Coe and I signed a memorandum of understanding for cooperation on Internet of Things security. And Secure by Design was at the absolute heart of that. And the UK published in 2018 a code of practice. It was a bit like food packaging. When you buy an IoT product, the aim is that you can tell whether the security updates will be done automatically, and if so, until what year. At the moment, you can't. So you could choose to buy a product where the security practices are poor, where the updates won't be automatic and they may be quite difficult to implement, and it'll be cheaper, but you know you're getting a less secure product. Or you can pay a little bit more, but you know that you're getting a more secure product. And now the UK is planning to put that into law. We announced this in March when I was still in office, and part of the prompt for that was we discovered some flaws in a small number of web cameras. And again, very important for the pandemic. It shouldn't be allowed that there should be defective manufacturing of things like web cameras. You shouldn't be allowed to sell that sort of thing. So you can see the principle here. We need to fix the underlying products and services. We need to have objective, measurable standards. We don't need to ban everything that isn't as secure as it might be, but we need to give consumers, whether that's corporates or individuals or governments, a choice. It's the information. Make security pay. And there is a role for regulation in that. There is a role for civic groups. There's a role for industry. And our thinking on this, thinking I've done, the thinking the UK government, when I was part of it, has done, but the thinking of colleagues across the world in Singapore and other places, has been initially done on IoT, because that's one of the next things, and it's literally something you can get your hands on. That's the whole point of it. It's an easy concept for people to understand. But I think we can apply the concept more widely. So my final point is about the opportunity. Unlike 25, 30 years ago, when the internet rather sprang up, and some people saw it coming, but most people didn't. The contours of the next generation of technology are reasonably clear. We know it's going to be IoT, we know it's going to be AI, we know it's going to be quantum in due course. There are other big technological shifts happening. So we can see them coming. We can, again, about 5G being another one. We can see these things coming. They're coming with us. So let's get in now and make security part of the conversation, part of the public policy, part of the industry strategy. So we're not faced with what we've been faced with for the last 10, 20 years, which is retrofitting security onto a model that's already there. Secure by design is the way forward. The opportunity is there, and the time to seize it is now. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Kieran. Very interesting presentation. Security by design. That is an important point, which I think we could discuss a bit more during the panel discussion, because it's a fascinating subject. But before that, let me go to Liisa for her views on the subject. Liisa, you want to start?
Absolutely. And I couldn't imagine a better introduction than that of what we've just heard from Kieran Martin. And I'll be looking at how the pandemic really highlighted the ways we can transition to security by designs and what are the lessons that can be learned from the past 6 months. And first of all, it's almost vulgar, but it's true. Cyber attacks will always take place. And furthermore, nations, those we're friends and allies with, and those we don't necessarily agree with on finer points of rule of law, for example, will always, going ahead, now use cyberspace as one of the domains to assert influence over each other. And this isn't just in terms of military tactics. So we're not talking about above the threshold of an armed attack in international law, but rather we're at a point now, as Ciaran also highlighted, where the development of internet has returned to defining what the backbone of it is. So many of us might have missed earlier this year how a certain Chinese telco presented a proposal for a new IP, a fundamentally different way to route internet traffic that will be discussed by the International Telecommunications Union later this year. And at the same time, we know that security of government technology is fundamentally a market failure sector. As was highlighted by the previous speaker, we've lived in a world where security doesn't pay. And add on to that government isn't always the smartest developer of technology or procurer of technology. So we also know, therefore, that the state-backed actors, the ones that pose the most existential threat in cybersecurity, are both resourceful and patient. Their resource to fly below the radar for years has been highlighted maybe most prominently by the 2016 election hacks. And they're patient because they're not out for monetary gain. And we saw some of that. There were reports of, in particular, a Chinese APT named Nikon that was taking advantage of the pandemic earlier this year. Similarly, spies are going to spy. And there's no reason why an intelligence agency of any state wouldn't, first of all, take advantage of all opportunities, but second of all, have had to learn very quickly how to protect a new domain or work with a new attack vector as global attention was on this pandemic. So all in all, whether we're speaking about government-backed, state-backed, APT type of attackers or cyber criminals, we know that they're reactive and opportunistic, seizing for the lowest hanging fruit, regardless of what their ultimate goal is. And in doing so, they took advantage of cyber criminals, for example, of government schemes to help those that suffered in the pandemic in spear phishing, in identity theft and impersonation. And there was a large number of that. So in my 10 inconvenient truths of how the pandemic taught us how to do security by design, the first 5 here are the ones we can't change. But now on to the good news, what it is that we can change. We know that disinformation is a large part of how also governments and those who are out to create doubt and confusion attack the very backbone, the trust in our societies. But to build resilience, given that how integrated this information is with cyber attacks, to build resilience, the only way ahead really is to educate the citizenry, to not share without thinking, not trust without looking for a secondary source, and to build an information space where the citizens know who's whispering into their ear so that there's transparency at platforms. And that's something that can be done both on the education and regulation of platform side. Secondly, as in this very speedy transition to remote work was demonstrated, the ecosystem has to be built up to be resilient, to be agile, and to roll with the blows, really, even on a national level. In Estonia, the transition to remote work was hasty, but reasonably smooth. And there were a few facilitators. One of them, of course, is our very high level of connectivity. So me working from an apartment in the center of Tallinn in terms of connectivity, so in terms of availability of a fast connection, did not really differ from the connection I have in my office less than a mile away, did not really differ from the connection friends of mine have who decided to move to their coastal summer cottages. But also a fundamental part of that ecosystem is digital identity, both of machines, but more importantly of humans. To be able to trust that the person you see across the table is also the person you see digitally when you're not able to see them with your own eyes directly. And given that Estonia for over 15 years now has had government-backed secure digital identity, we were in a good place to both continue that trust relationship, but also carry on signing contracts, logging in and authenticating ourselves into thousands of digital services, and digitally signing almost anything. As many of you would know, as in Estonia, there's 3 things you can't do with digital signature: marriage, divorce, as my ex-husband inconveniently found out too late for him, and transfer of property. The 8th inevitable factor is that there will always be vulnerabilities. And that's why resilience and agility come in, because vulnerabilities in any hardware software are inevitable by the mere virtue of how technology comes together in the modern world. And that also is true in medical technology. I have to say, one of the silver linings, so one of the good news throughout this crisis for the crisis manager and the risk manager in me was that there wasn't a major attack on medical technology that's, notoriously full of vulnerabilities and has notoriously long patch cycles. In fact, it's well known that there's vulnerabilities where the CVE code starts on 1.9, meaning they were first reported and were codified in the previous century. So that's the one silver lining. And we saw vulnerabilities in Zoom, in smartphones. In fact, attacks, most importantly, ransomware attacks against the medical technology in a hospital in Brno in the Czech Republic, against Fresenius, one of the biggest medical technology suppliers in the world. So whenever building a system that's to be secure by design, you have to assume there's going to be vulnerabilities and you have to be resilient. Which brings us to this quick transition to remote work that really accelerated the digital transformation and highlighted the balance between the three elements of cybersecurity, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and often peg those three against each other. And in that, we learned that without availability, the others don't matter. That was most important when it came to replacing meetings, especially meetings that were on a confidential or unclassified level. So they're not classified, but they include information that's not fully publicly known. How would you find a trusted video conferencing, most likely, solution that all parties have access to, that runs on your own infrastructure preferably, and that doesn't transmit information across national boundaries? Really was one of the big puzzles there. And how do you make that available? Balancing that with availability of a way to connect with colleagues. Then having the infrastructure available in terms of hardware, connections, and also little things like, is there a work machine that can be taken to the home or to the remote work location? And in terms of tools, again, the video meeting tools became really fundamental. And finally, the question of policies. Many spoke about the need for VPNs, virtual private networks, or other privacy tools in the pandemic, but that's only relevant if you don't have a good security policy in place where VPN is a default approach anyway. So really, these are the lessons of security by design that were accelerated, I would say, in some places by a decade by the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Liisa, for a very interesting perspective and about security by design and how we can navigate this current pandemic situation and beyond. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Shashi Jayakumar to do his presentation. Shashi, you want to come on?
Thank you very much, Amit. Thank you, Liisa and Ciaran. I've learned a lot from what you've had to say. I don't have a great deal of time, so I'm going to speak firstly about what Singapore has been through in the last 6 months or so. Secondly, some of the risks we face. Thirdly, thoughts beyond COVID, where we might be going. And finally, I'd like to offer, in conclusion, 1 or 2 thoughts in terms of Singapore's future as a smart nation. I'll begin by saying that what's happened in Singapore, not just COVID, but to some degree the general election, has brought into sharper relief various fissures and pressure points. What we've seen in Singapore, particularly for COVID, is not hybrid warfare against us or state-sponsored disinformation. This has happened, but that's a separate issue, which I can go into later. But in the last 6-7 months or so, we've had a great deal of what we call disinformation, but which is really misinformation. It's not so much targeted at us from the outside, but it's more false rumors having to do with extremely local concerns. Quite often, these are circulated in the one WhatsApp group that you cannot exit, which is the family WhatsApp group. These have to do with, for example, I'm sure the Singaporeans are aware, an announcement which is false that Singaporeans would not be allowed to travel outside the region, that they live in Singapore, and that soldiers would be deployed to enforce this. Completely false. And there are various other rumors concerning cost of living, jobs, situation at supermarkets, and so on. So it's been very, very local, in some ways almost hyper-local concerns. I will share with you that there has been some attempt on the part of think tanks to do some preliminary findings together with firms who specialize in social media analytics. So it's very preliminary, and we're about to publish on this, but I thought you might be interested in sort of a sneak preview in terms of what we found out. One is that GovSG, MOH, various other websites did actually significantly up their game during the COVID period in terms of swift rebuttals and drawing falsity out, saying that they are aware and stating on various websites that they're correcting the misconceptions. We did, however, find the suggestion, I'll be interested in other views, that there were far too many government digital platforms, and social media conversations that we monitored shows that this actually contributed to a somewhat confusing and frustrating user experience. Even after fact checks are issued, what we find is that misinformation continues to circulate on social media and other messaging platforms. I'm not saying that there is a correlation, but if I were to go on to POFMA, the Singapore Online Protection Against Online Falsehoods Act, and I would stress that what I have here is very preliminary, still internal. But while POFMA may have succeeded in putting out government's point of view, the official point of view, the official correction, it is very much uncertain based on what we found, whether this actually had any success in changing people's minds on the issue. So obviously this is very preliminary. We do need to publish and check the evidence again, but I thought you might be interested in one or two of the findings. The second point I'd like to move on to is actually fault lines. One of the issues that we face when we look at what's happened in Singapore in the last few months, and here I'm moving beyond COVID to look at longer term threats and fissures, is the importation of ideas from other parts of the world. Mind you, I look at terrorism, I look at cyber threats, I look at all kinds of threats in my center. But the one which really concerns me is this kind of importation. And I think we have a lot to learn from other parts of Asia, which are beginning to suffer from identity politics, polarization, and other kinds of ethno-religious nationalism. One important aspect of this is hate spin, or manufactured vilification online, or indignation, use of a strategy, sometimes organized, which exploits group identity to mobilize supporters. And of course, this can spin off in various ways, potentially. Could have to do with class, could have to do with inequality, it could have to do with locals, foreigners. So that's the issue, actually, which concerns me, identity, and my think tank the most. I'm moving on to my third point now, which is a somewhat obvious question. What can we do about it? Well, I'd like to bring us back to a concept which is actually rather old, and that's the concept of resilience. It's sort of been kicking around and been inchoate for some time. I think it's possibly due for a rethink or revamp. And I'll share with you, I think some Singaporeans in the room here may know that there are think tanks and research institutes in Singapore which were set up some time back to look at this on account of other concerns in the previous decade. And I mean, not the one just passed, but the noughties. And the concern there was not so much cyber information, but it was more radicalization and terrorism, the ability to bounce back, the bounce back ability of society after a terror attack. But obviously the metrics there are a little bit easier. How many people you arrest, how many engagements you have, work done by the ILCCs or the interreligious organization, the RO. And of course, that's not to say that work has not been built on. We have the community engagement program and latterly SG Secure. But again, that's for a particular type of threat. At what stage, and here I'm sort of posing a hypothetical question or rhetorical question, at what stage do we start to have reasoned, mature conversations about these kinds of issues and the new threats we're talking about? Listen very carefully to what Liisa has to say. In Estonia, and indeed in the Baltic countries, the government takes the people into confidence, and you have reasoned adult conversations where they have an adversary. And obviously in the Baltics, you have a potential adversary on the doorstep. The adversary here in Singapore may well be within. And it's within us, I would suggest, that we have manifold polarizations which are taking place even as we speak. Now, of course, I don't want to exaggerate. When I look at the cancel culture, George Floyd protests, BLM, I don't think we have this here in Singapore. On the surface of it, we don't have overt racism, but we do have microaggressions, racial slights, kinds of episodes which get talked about and amplified by social media, which are increasingly being discussed in public discourse in Singapore. The genie is very much out of the bottle. And how do you combat this? Of course, government has its initiatives, and some of these have been shared. But I do think, looking at the Baltics and parts of Europe, we do need what we see there, which is loose coalitions, ground-up coalitions, civilian militia, such as Stop Fake, which some of you may be familiar with. We also need a constant gaming of scenarios, communities of practice. And I'll share with you that whenever I've been abroad to study these sorts of communities, never trust the people who call themselves misinformation experts. The most interesting insights are actually those who come from branding, social media, consultancies, people who understand young people. And I would suggest, I'm not sure the government is interested, but I would suggest that these communities are difficult and messy to put together, and they do not always give policymakers type of answers which are readily digestible. But I think this is important, and I think for governments and possibly security services, we need to work out how we're going to live in a compromised and degraded security information environment. I can't resist to quote Lee Kuan Yew talking about a confrontation, which is undeclared conflict with Indonesia in 1964. Obviously, we're friends with Indonesia now, but he says, and I quote, "We've got to build up men and troops who can meet this kind of warfare, constant harassing, constant pressure, no real war as such, but international thuggery. This is what it is, and we've got to train our men to meet this sort of situation," end quote. I'm coming to the end now, but I feel I have to talk to the theme of this panel, which is security by design, and I want to look at some potential futures of our smart nation. How do you design a smart and secure nation? Obviously, many of you are far more expert in cybersecurity than I am, but increasingly in my travels, when we do our research, when we do our studies, we find that critical thinking is something which comes up very, very important, in a very, very important sense. So this is not the security by design in the technical sense, but if you look at all that COVID has shown us, possibly even polarizations in the election, these things reveal a great deal about the true nature, character, and makeup of Singapore. And we must assume that adversaries, if we have any, or our friends, maybe especially our friends, are watching with interest and concern. I think more interest, actually, about what these polarizations reveal. So SMS Janil has given you a good sense of what government agencies have been doing within the context of COVID and our smart nation in terms of actual initiatives. But one or two things I think I want to draw our attention to is that the smart nation architecture is considerably more evolved a few years ago than when the Smart Nation project was announced. And many agencies are now involved now, several more ministers and ministries involved now, and there's ongoing and good work in terms of the resilience of systems. I would suggest that it's critical, actually, from time to time to ask the question, what about the resilience of people? I mentioned critical thinking, and I think that's going to be very, very important, but there's an overall point, just drawing back in conclusion, an overall point I want to make. People who do this kind of resilience of people really well, the states who do it very well, rather, are beginning to be more interested in what some people call heritage skills. Australians talk about it. There are others who talk about it in terms of rediscovering a kind of intergroup and intragroup contact, obviously very important for multicultural, plural, and diverse societies. And this kind of contact, sociologists and ethnographers are aware of this, does have the effect of reducing anxieties about each other. I guess the point, or rather the counterpoint I want to make is that even though this is not an antidote, it will help. And some of these things that will help in our smart nation futures have actually very, very little to do with digital. It's actually more in terms of rediscovering some of what has been lost. So I'm going to pause here. I look forward to any questions that we might have.
Thank you, Dr. Jayakumar. That was a great presentation, and you really covered some new interesting angles, which we can discuss a bit later during the panel discussion. But before that, I'll hand over the stage to Tanya Thakkar from Trend Micro. Tanya, you want to give your presentation?
Thank you, Amit. And yeah, it's incredible, all the different angles in terms of the security by design. And I'm really thankful to all the colleagues here to sharing, their views and really bringing this topic to light. I work for Trend Micro and I'm responsible for Asia, Middle East, and Africa. And I have to say, my last travel was in February, and this is probably the longest I've gone for no business travel for as long as I remember. And as Trend Micro, for last 30 years since the forming, our vision has been to make the world, safe for exchanging digital information. So what I wanted to do today in terms of the security by design is to bring technology into play, and hopefully, in terms of I can share the wisdoms of dealing with coronavirus and what does it really mean from technology and how it can potentially help. As we all know, we are definitely living in the new world, the new Singapore, and every country that's being represented here. And no one really anticipated, the world we will be living in. But there were a few things that were expected. Anytime something like this happens, and we saw, the ransomware attack went on rise. There were definitely a lot of COVID-19 related lures came into play. Whether they were email related, whether they were, getting people to click on certain types of news, fake news, whatever it was. And in the first half of 2020, we ourselves blocked about 8.8 million COVID-19 related threats. And overall, about 27 billion threats were stopped, but 93% were email-based. So that's, even though it might seem a lot, it might seem, hey, there's a lot going on. As a cybersecurity vendor, I would say, hey, that was expected. We knew whenever something like this happens that there will be, criminals who will jump on it and try to take advantage of it. Well, there's definitely the unexpected part. And hey, if this is, the nature of, how the Zoom meetings are being done with everyone working from home. This is one of my leaders in Turkey. Well, this is really the unexpected part, right? And I'm wearing the jacket right now, so I'm not really going to show, but I think you may get the idea that, I have something very similar underneath as well. And of course, certainly we all found in this cybersecurity industry, and I believe the same applies to all my colleagues on the call, everyone thought, hey, with this lockdown and, working from home, there will be a lot more time to rest, but things have not been the same. In fact, the amount of activity, the number of targeted attacks that are going on has increased manifold. And some of those don't even show up in the media because organizations, depending on the nation's, cybersecurity policies, may not need to reveal, all the threats they are facing. But on a little bit on a serious note, certainly from a pandemic, there were a number of unexpected things. The number of vulnerabilities that were disclosed, went up. The number of vulnerabilities in IoT devices went up. Even though working from home, by and large, worked out okay, a lot of organizations made a lot more compromises in terms of allowing their workers to work from home, and therefore make exceptions to security policies that really led into some unexpected breaches. And so let's look at, from a COVID perspective, how the countries responded. And I think most countries said, hey, if we can prevent an infection from happening in our citizens, that's the best thing. And a number of things were employed depending on the country: social distancing, washing hands, working from home, lockdowns where it was required. If unable to prevent, then the government said, hey, I think we need to detect, and how quickly can we detect? And Singapore's done an amazing job in terms of contact tracing. Number of countries, both in Europe and here in Singapore, that amount of testing was increased heavily, because we all realize that even though the numbers may show that there's a lot more cases being found, that widespread testing is a really good way to detect early on. And then detection alone is not important. A response part came into the need. And for that, working on the vaccine, increasing the medical supplies, building quarantine centers to make sure how quickly can you respond once that detection comes into place. And then the last one is, hey, if you can do prevention, detection, response, can you predict? Can you predict where that next wave is going to be? Can you predict the clusters? Can you predict the growth? Is it in the healthcare workers? Is it in factory workers? Is it in education? Is it with the nurses? And so that prediction came into place, and the countries that really did good are the ones that looked at all four together, not just as a single piece, but as a continuous assessment and adjustment. And it required, implementing measures, adjusting, and just learning as you go along, but making sure that all four were put into place. From a cybersecurity perspective, the same rules apply. And this has really been the biggest learning for anyone who is looking at cybersecurity. Prevent if you can, and there's various technologies available in terms of how can you prevent things from happening in the first place. But if you can prevent, and typically it takes about 180 days before an attack is detected, whether it's in a government, whether it's in a private organization, 180 days on an average. So if you can prevent, it's really important that somehow you be able to detect. And just like COVID-19, detection alone isn't going to cut it. You need to be able to respond. How quickly can you make those policy changes, investigate those incidents? How can you analyze those? And then get into the zone of how can you start predicting these things. So really from a cybersecurity, it's important that organizations, just like COVID-19, really look at that prevention, detection, response, and prediction in a continuous assessment way. And it's one thing to say, hey, this is a good model, but at the end of the day, and we've been through many cases where whether it's a government or private organization, when they have a breach, a lot of interesting questions come in. How did the hacker come in? Who was the patient zero? Well, even on COVID-19, we are still arguing about where the patient zero was. Was it China? Was it anywhere else? But it's the same similar question, right? What systems are affected? Was there anything went out? And so those questions become important. And where the world is moving, and I think this part is really, really critical. We used to live in these silos where you have these endpoints and emails and servers and network and cloud and OT devices and IoT and whatnot, and all the things were collected in their own silos. And now, through the power of computing, we are able to connect them together. And that connection point has become extremely important to this piece of technology that is coming up very heavily, which is called cross-layer detection and response, or XDR in short. And that really allows you to correlate this data across these various things to come up with that highly actionable thing. And that's really, whether it's the world that we are going to enter post COVID-19, or if you look at the future resiliency of the government networks, I think it's becoming extremely, extremely important. And that's really, what will allow us to be fearless, as we move forward. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for a great presentation. So now we come to our quick panel discussion. Now, there's one question I'd like to throw open to all the panelists and to hear their views. Now, we've been talking about need to redesign the internet and to put in security to ensure that you can stop cyber attacks and ransomware attacks and things like that. But here's the thing: to do something like that, it has to be an international effort. Now, by many countries. I know we were talking, Ciaran talked about how Estonia, Singapore, and the UK have collaborated together to sort of design better security protocols. And I'm sure there are a lot of other collaborations going on. But I really think it has to be an all-told international effort. But here you have espionage, government-backed threat actors, and such people also in the mix. So in short, in order to build a better internet, to repair the security lapses that the internet has, how do you get everyone on board? Because unless you do that and everyone is on the same page, I have a feeling that cybersecurity will still remain a reactive thing. You basically hope for the best and keep the best systems ready, and the attacker has his time and place of choosing how to attack. So your views on that? I'll ask anyone. Liisa, you want to go in first with your views?
Sure. I'll go first, and I think Shashi really highlighted that when talking about disinformation. And Ciaran will attest that the way we cooperated often was that one of his deputies, and another 24 government officials from another 24 European nations were locked into a well-lit, well-ventilated, and well-fed and watered room until we came up with a solution when talking about election security, for example. So building these communities of trust that facilitate information sharing and then later cooperation in a really meaningful way is fundamental. And in international space, and even amongst like-minded nations, we're still in a point where everyone declaratively, of course, believes in community building and trust and information sharing. But you can be damn sure that I'll only show you mine once you've shown me yours. So there's this almost like deterrence of waiting for the first comer. And Estonia has been, since 2007, aggressively transparent. So we've not had a problem showing ours first, because we realize we're not going to figure this out by ourselves. And it's very clear that you don't figure that cooperation and that sharing mechanism out in a crisis, because in a crisis, you're too busy keeping all your balls in the air, or at least only dropping the bouncy ones. And it's not an institutional question. You know, the best characterization of that was a rapid alert system that was designed in the European Union before the 2019 EU elections. And that was characterized by a certain international publication as a great system, other than it wasn't rapid, it did not include alerts, and strictly speaking, it wasn't really a system either. So you need to build that trust, and that goes from cooperating, on a technical level with incident sharing, with working on open source communities. That saved Estonia's backside at least once. Exercising and frankly using international organizations to balance corporate interests. There's plenty of those who are critical of certain multinationals that have been trying to define international law, or at least how it's practiced, which they're doing in the absence of states doing that. Microsoft is in the business of building technology and selling it. And it's only speaking about international norms because someone needs to, and someone with a reasonable market power needs to. So that's where international organizations, be it EU, be it some sort of a global coalition, be it regional organizations, really comes in, since no single nation has enough of a market power, and that includes the largest nations and the wealthiest nations in the world, to really impose the security standard of a major conglomerate's corporate product. So that all happens through practice and through routine practice, in exercises, in threat sharing, in figuring out the way, and not through technical platforms, and not in a crisis, first and foremost.
Thank you, Liisa. Kieran, you want to share your views on this aspect of international cooperation? How do you get countries which essentially are competing each other in various levels, including in intelligence gathering, to sit across the table and come forward with a set of guidelines which everyone is going to sort of adhere to in order to make the internet a safer place?
Well, it works sometimes in some areas, and Liisa's alluded to some of those forums in Europe. But I think, to be slightly provocative, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the premise of the question, because I do think that we, in two ways. One is the internet has more borders than people realize. Borders operate in different ways, but the internet is not borderless. The experience of the internet user in China is very different from the experience of the internet user in Europe and North America, and so on, and increasingly so, actually. And the trends seem to be around a plurality of models of the internet rather than a single one. And secondly, I think we're learning from hard experience. It would be great if there was a great digital treaty governing the whole of the world, but we've been trying for quite a long time at various levels, and the momentum isn't there in many key areas. So the choice there is to accept reality and do what you can, or give up. And I think there is a tendency in cybersecurity, whether it's about skills, whether it's about international cooperation, to despair rather than look at what is possible. So I think two things. One is individual countries can do useful things. I think, why is the UK cooperating with countries like Singapore? Well, because we're both reasonably, I hope, competent in matters of cybersecurity. So there's stuff we can do. I would put, obviously, Estonia very, very highly in that category as well. And for countries who can do useful things in terms of internet security, then you end up having a modest competitive advantage. If you look at the attackers, particularly the commercially motivated attackers, the great big organized crime syndicates, if your digital infrastructure is a harder target than neighboring countries, then they'll go to the neighboring country. So I do think that there is actually that competitive element. I'm not talking about espionage or anything like that. I just mean that actually, security can pay at national level if you do it well. So I long for and hope for the day where there is a much greater sort of sense of systematic international cooperation than there is at the moment, but there isn't. So we make the best of it. And I think like-minded countries committed to free and open internets with good levels of skills and government and industry momentum can work together to achieve some of the solutions.
So essentially, what you're saying is that eventually we're already seeing that the internet may not be as seamless as we think it is, but there could be, sort of different views from different countries, which is probably the best way forward given the lack of total international cooperation. But
here's another
Shashi,
view on it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
And I have to align a little bit with Professor Kieran here. I would also say the same thing, but I'll highlight one other area. I would say that yes, absolutely. In terms of maybe the like-minded countries working together to a certain extent is all good, but when things get really tough, it's really hard to get the countries to really start sharing. And this is where there is a very important play, the public-private partnerships can play. When you look at it this way, a lot of the organization, including ours, would be highly international, working in hundreds of countries across the globe, and we have the infrastructure to anonymize a lot of things. And therefore, if there is a sharing that can happen between a certain government and a certain private sector, and if that can be shared without sharing exactly what it's coming from, but inform organization, it becomes highly useful. And I'll give an example. We were involved in a similar scenario about 3 years ago on the European side. And a lot of you guys would have heard of APT29 or Cozy Bear hackers, and certainly their involvement in various elections and whatnot. And in a similar way, for us to then look at what they are doing in the underground and passing the information off to other governments, rather than the government that initially faced that incident in the first place to say, hey, we are actually going through this and here's information. That's really, really hard. But for an organization where there is partnerships and certain information can be shared in a very objective and a constructive way, can actually help. And certainly we saw that, with the European elections and the kind of things that were going on at that time.
No, that's interesting then. Yeah. Shashi, you have your comments on this aspect?
Thank you. Thank you. Just to point out something which I think many of us already know, there have been ongoing norms discussions, 2 sets of norm discussions within the United Nations, the GGE and the OEWG, for some time now. I'm going to be rather critical and say that in 2017, the GGE discussions were torpedoed on account of big power interests, although big powers use their proxies to do so. At the ASEAN level, by dint of diplomacy, certain countries, including Singapore, were instrumental in getting ASEAN to subscribe to the GGE norms, 2015, the one which was more successful. But I guess the real point is that we may have to accept that these norms discussions, while they are good, they can continue, they must continue, are going to run up against a lot of obstacles, not least realpolitik. Something which has been alluded to is activity of Chinese APTs, but there is an APT associated with an ASEAN country, which was early implicated in espionage against China in terms of trying to find out what was going on from the various communicable diseases centers. This is, from the point of view of the state doing this, if this is true, and I must stress this allegation, this is a matter of state survival. You do need this advantage. You do want this first advantage. And there's so many potential obstacles. For example, the US's offensive posture in cyberspace, which is, from their point of view, is defense. I'm just calling out this example, but of course, many other countries are doing this as well. And one of the last points is that fake news, disinformation hardly gets a look in all the fraught as it is, GGE and OEWG discussions. So really, while I think these discussions must continue, you have to accept, in my view, that kinds of discussions may not come to an easy resolution within the next 5 or even 10 years. If you look at the UN Law of the Sea, just as an unrelated example, that was decades in the making, and the final product, while in my view successful for UNCLOS, was actually quite different in the ending stage than it had been conceived of in the beginning. I'm not trying to undermine the importance of discussion, but at the bilateral level, regional level, cert-to-cert cooperation, centers of excellence, such as we have here in Singapore for cyber, we will have to continue. And a lot of the meaningful discussion, especially on the technical side, I think we have to accept will take away from the media and behind closed doors.
Thank you, Shashi. We are almost out of time. One last point I want to throw open to the panelists is the fact that while the challenges are many, I think we are at the cusp of a great opportunity. Kieran did mention a bit of that. We have industrial IoT coming up in a massive scale. We're having 5G networks, which are going to usher in a paradigm shift in internet connectivity, and we are having countries building smart cities and smart nations using the latest digital technologies. So basically, we are rebuilding our internet and rebuilding our technological tools and even rebuilding our society. So maybe the first internet which Windsurf and the others built was almost accidentally built. But this time we are aware of what we need to do, and can we do it in a better way if we are going to build something, if I may call Internet 2.0, in the sense that what 5G is going to bring. So what are the positives of building a resilient system? Instead of talking about all the difficulties, let's talk about what is achievable and what we can do better. Kieran, you want to give a shot at that aspect?
Sure. Well, that's a question I definitely do agree with. I think you've summed it up really well. And I think to pick up a point Shashi made in a different context earlier, I think transparency is absolutely key to this. So I think you've set out the challenge and opportunity really well. It would be a generational mistake that we mustn't make to get security wrong in the next phase of technology, because we know broadly what it's going to be, what it's going to look like. And let's take 5G. I think hype is our enemy and transparency is our friend. You know, all the hype about 5G, that everything is going to be dependent on it tomorrow, and if we're all going to be catastrophically hurt if something goes wrong. I mean, let's break it down. Let's take autonomous vehicles. There's a huge role for ordinary transport regulation here. We're not going to have cars all over the road where the only thing between you and a crash is the maintenance of a mobile phone connection. There's going to be other things. Those need to be explained. And you mentioned resilience. When we build these systems, as Lisa's presentation said, assume cyber attacks all the time of varying levels of sophistication and assume some of them get through. How do you make sure they don't catastrophically impair a network. That is possible, and it's easiest to do at the building phase. So let's build it properly and securely.
Thank you. Tanya, you want to give a shot at that from the technology point of view? How we're going to build resilient systems in a 5G environment?
Yeah, sure. And I think, beside the 5G, and I think Kieran talked about 5G a little bit, I'll touch upon IoT because I'm equally excited about, that word is bringing to us. And the reason why I bring that up a little bit more than the 5G is the challenges or the approaches that we've taken in terms of securing the environments will certainly have to shift. The IoT devices, even if you look at Singapore and what it's doing with the shipping, what it's doing at the hospitals, what it's doing in the education environment, I think everywhere, we are ensuring that we have these Wi-Fi connected devices, right, that are providing incredible value. But as one of the Trend Micro reports, and every 3 months we produce the report, it's showing that the number of vulnerabilities in these devices is growing like crazy. And the challenge is, and it's a very interesting one because governments are also dealing with the same thing. And I think Liisa, in one of her articles, had written about who is responsible or who should be held responsible for ensuring the security of these IoT devices. Is it the vendor who is producing? Is it some other organization's role? And the challenge is very simple. Once these devices are produced and they are out there, let's say if they are put it in a road that is measuring the amount of traffic that's going through, or it's measuring how strong the cement is on a certain pavement. That device is there permanently, right, until it goes out. But it is Wi-Fi connected, or a device that is plugged into baby monitors. And so the challenge or the world we are finding ourselves in is, in terms of dealing with those things, we might have to shift our focus from securing those endpoints all the way down to the fabric, or all the way down to the telecommunications layer where they actually connect into the backbone. And I bring up the IoT because on a 5G, it's exactly the same thing. We now have to start shifting in terms of how you can plug that security in right at the gateway level in a way that it's providing the right security for those who are connecting in. And that's really different than what we've been used to. We've started having a lot of discussions with the governments on the similar side, where the governments are also, especially on the Singapore side, the discussions led to who is responsible for providing that 5G security. Is it the telecom provider? Is it part of it's funded by government? Or is it the users that's actually connecting in to use that 5G network? And the answer is not very straightforward, but I guess the discussions are going on, and at the end, it's going to come out to be more than likely a shared responsibility. But it's very different than what we've dealt with, and I believe that those discussions are going to continue in terms of what's the best way to address those challenges.
Thank you. Liisa, your views on better, bolder internet?
So I'll sort of start where Kieran finished, which is to stop the overarching over-mystification of this whole sector, and to expect a safer internet to just pop up somehow, somewhere, and use these terms that in combination end up meaning nothing. When someone tries to sell you something that's GDPR compliant, AI and enabled, 5G ready, that doesn't really mean a thing. And I'm a non-technical girl, and I understand that, So instead, start where we are. In terms of norm creation, that means start not with imposing a super norm from above, because as Shashi highlighted and others alluded to, that really hasn't worked out too well for us. But either start sectorially, or more importantly, start at where the practice is. And the best understanding of practitioners has been summed up in the Tallinn Manual 2.0, which isn't great reading because it's named after a city I currently happen to be in, but because it really takes the best understanding of some of the top practitioners of international law and then applies it to cyberspace. And in terms of operational or technical field, that means, again, don't superimpose some sort of structures, but look at the useful and the actionable. And from there, you can build trust and you can build practice, because building a superstructure has really not worked for us at all.
Thank you, Liisa. And Shashi, your comments on this?
When we start to talk about a resilient internet infrastructure of the internet, we have to accept that governments have cultural differences and point of views when it comes to the internet. There is a certain point of view where some would say, let's just protect the superstructure of the internet, the piping of the internet. But to continue with this pipes analogy, there are others, increasing numbers in this age, who want to say, we want to know what's inside the pipes. We want to protect what's inside. And the protection can also, to some degree, mean control. And this can happen in a very fraught or tense periods like COVID, or it can happen in the name of defending the nation from disinformation, cyber, or hybrid attacks. So if you look at some of the fake news laws which have been unveiled within ASEAN countries, this is just ASEAN within the last couple of years, these are pretty hard-hitting. They don't go by the name of fake news laws. Some are cyber laws, but all-encompassing and encapsulating clauses within in terms of the ability to question, interrogate, seize information, to prosecute anything which goes against the state itself, which makes, by the way, the Singapore POFMA look fairly mild in comparison. So if you're going to have that, and the social media companies are going to comply, inevitably you're going to get more and more of what we call this balkanization of the internet, which I don't think we have time to go into. Mind you, I'm not saying nation states are intentionally or maliciously going down in this direction, but in the name of protecting their people, sometimes you sort of get a drift or policy drift rather than one single decision to control the internet. So I think we need to be careful about this. I don't know what analogy works well here, but maybe biting off your nose to spite your face, because sometimes in an attempt to stave off or to combat adversaries who are themselves illiberal, you start to take moves which are rather illiberal in itself to protect yourself and your people. And I think we need to be very careful about that.
Thank you, Shashi. Some very interesting thoughts there. And I think Joshua is looking anxiously, and I think we've run over time. He has a lot of other things to sort of attend to.
Amit, that was a fantastic session. Thank you very much to our panelists.
Thank you.
For taking the time out of your day today. We really appreciate it. It was really incredible. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Amit, for the great job.
No, thank you. It was my pleasure and honor to host such a wonderful panel. And we had a lot of interesting discussions. I think we could have talked for the whole day if we wanted to, or if we had the time. But let me also personally thank everybody, Professor Kieran, Shashi, Liisa, Tanya. Thank you very much for taking time to attend this panel. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And thank you. And it's been a pleasure meeting you all here. Thank you. Over to you, Joshua. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. And that's all we've got time for today at the GovInsider Live Festival of Innovation. But we have a week of incredible sessions coming up for you. The next one is tomorrow, 10 a.m. GMT +8. That's Singapore time. And this is on data and transformation. We have Singapore's IHIS, the health tech group, talking about emerging services, AI and robotics, and how they're transforming tech. We have a brilliant senior figure from the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, the head of statistics, talking about the value of data. We have a fantastic CEO from Singapore's own SP Digital, talking about the use of data within the utilities sector. And we have Henry Sell, CIO of our partners at Cloudera. That is well worth tuning into tomorrow. Thank you so much for making the time today. Look at GovInsider's Facebook page, facebook.com/GovInsider, or GovInsider's YouTube page, or go to govinsider.live to join any of the sessions that we have over the course of the week. Thanks very much, everyone, and I'll see you again.